Hello, everyone, and welcome to College Information Week. We couldn't have asked for a better guest for our topic that we're going to talk about here, and that is standardized testing in the college admissions process. I think if there's something we've seen as a change over the last couple of years is the reemergence of SATs and ACTs and the role that they're playing in the decision that colleges are making and what plans our students need to make for them in order to best present themselves. So we have an expert here, our principal, John Serafine, to talk about standardized tests. And John, can you just kick things off and talk a little bit about your thoughts about the role that they play in the process?
Sure. First of all, thank you for doing this College Information Week. I think it's a really important week for our students and their parents. And I saw the lineup of presentations, and it's comprehensive. And I hope all the parents out there get a chance to watch all of them. So, thank you for doing this. And I don't know if being called an expert is you have to pretty loosely define expert, but I have spent a lot of time, with working with SATs, right? So as you're well aware, I spent most of my professional life as a high school counselor, college counselor. I've also taught SAT prep classes for not probably, for a better part of 30 years and do a ton of private tutoring and run a summer class at Nazareth. So the only reason I say this is to let you know that I've seen this, the SATs come and go and change and morph into different things from a lot of different angles. And I'm probably one of the only, I guess nerd might be the best word, that's probably seen every SAT for the last 30 years. But I would say I'm in the minority of people who think that the SAT really is a good thing in the in the ACTs, because I think they do exactly what they were designed to do. I think we, being educators, parents, students, make them out to be this like IQ test and this measure of how successful you're going to be in life, and that's not what they are, nor is that what they were designed to do. So quite simply, these tests are designed to measure a high school student's readiness to perform at the freshman level in college. Um, and I, for one, think they do a really super job of doing that. They are heavily, heavily biased in favor of kids who read a lot, which I don't think is a terrible thing at all. Um, they're language heavy tests. And I think that they do a great job predicting a student's their readiness to perform once they get to a college campus. And I'm proud of, one of the things I'm proud of here at McQuaid is I think we do a really nice job pushing our students to read a lot. And quite frankly, that's the best preparation for any of these tests.
Well, John, can you talk a little bit about the difference between those two major exams, the SAT and the ACT, from your perspective?
Sure, I'll walk you through like the typical testing schedule for a high school student. So the PSAT is the kind of the entry level test into this whole suite of tests, right? Um, we offer it here to our 11th graders, offer it also to our 10th graders if they choose to take it. But the PSAT is just a practice test, so the most important letter in that acronym is the P. It's a preliminary or practice test. It's kind of, if you're in athletic terms, it's basically a scrimmage. I always say to kids, it doesn't go on your record. It's not in your transcript. They don't get sent to colleges. So it's a practice test, and it's just a shorter version of the SAT. Um, and for parents out there who haven't taken the SAT for X number of years, the SAT has gone through a couple significant changes in the last 10 years. And the most recent one is where it just all went to an online format. The length of it has been reduced fairly significantly. Now it's essentially little over 2 hour test, all computerized, two parts, an English part and a math part. Um, so that's basically the SAT and the PSAT. They're what they call adaptive tests now. So what that simply means is, so on the SAT, there's two reading and writing modules. So everyone takes reading and writing module one. Depending on how well they score in that module determines whether they go to the harder module 2A or they go take the less difficult module 2B, which kind of begs the question, well, why wouldn't you want to go down and take the easier module 2B? And the answer is because if you get to Module 2B, your score is capped. You're not going to be able to score above a certain point. So that's something that's a little bit, I think, confusing for kids, when they're trying to figure out, I'm in Module 1, I went to a Module 2A, et cetera. But anyway, the reading and writing is half the test, and then the other half is math. And the math is essentially algebra, geometry, a little tiny bit of algebra two, but basically algebra and geometry. And to go back to the reading and writing, the skill set that you have to have is grammar is huge on all these tests. And the stark reality is in most places, high school English classes, there not a lot of time is spent on grammar. And I don't care if you're taking AP language, AP literature, our kids are reading a lot, but I don't know if kids are getting enough grammar instruction. So kids tend to get beat up a little bit on the grammar part of that. So it's grammar, it's reading comprehension, and even though there's not a dedicated vocabulary section anymore, which they did away with a few years back, um, there's still a lot of tough vocabulary words. So oftentimes when I'm tutoring kids, they say, well, there's no vocab section anymore. It's like, well, there isn't, but the test is littered with, high level vocabulary. And if you don't have a great vocabulary, you're going to struggle. So that's essentially the SAT. The primary difference between SAT and ACT, you have to keep in mind that they're business rivals, right? They're big competitors. So when the SAT makes a change, it's likely that the ACT is going to follow suit and vice versa. And that's sort of what's happened. So the primary difference is this, where the SAT has the reading and writing and the math, the ACT has a science component, which they've had for years, which isn't addressed at all on the SAT. So just last year, the ACT has now made their science section optional. So when kids sign up to take the ACT, they can take the ACT with science or they can take the ACT without science, which is kind of a strategic move that kids have to make. The ACT also has an optional essay or a writing component to it also, which really, quite honestly, I wouldn't recommend that for 99.9% of the people. So to get back to your original question, what's the bigger difference? I think they're both testing pretty much the same skill set, right? The math and the reading and language skills are very, very similar. The ACT offers that the optional science piece. Right? So if let's say if you're a really strong math student, 50% of the SAT's math. If you're not, the ACT is it's either a third of the test, or if you take the science, it's only a quarter of your test. So I think that's something to consider. And I think also years ago, the ACT was kind of like the little sister to the SATs.
Right.
It was kind of a Midwest test or a West Coast test. So here in the East, it really wasn't a major player. Now it is. And it's kind of accepted. I think colleges look at both of them pretty equally, quite frankly.
Yeah, we actually when we meet with our juniors in our college planning seminars, we give them an SAT, ACT concordance table so they can look at a score on their SAT, and here's what an equivalent score would be on the ACT if they take both tests to really help them decide which one might be best for them. Do you have any advice on that, John? Just because I think so many students think about, okay, I'm going to plan to take my SATs. Do you have a recommended sort of schedule when students should think about when do they take their SAT? Do they take an ACT? How do they fit that all in?
Yep, and that's changed a little bit also. I worry sometimes about the whole over testing thing, but I'm a big fan of having kids take their PSATs a couple times. I think taking it in the PSAT is only offered in October. It's offered once a year. So I think taking it in 10th grade and 11th grade is a good idea as long as you're not overly intimidated or blown away by the test. I don't think you want kids' first testing experience to be a negative one, right?
Mhm.
But I think preparing for the PSAT and taking those in October of 10th grade and then taking them in October of 11th grade is a good idea. Then the SAT is offered in multiple times throughout the year. The major test points are March, May, and June. So I don't see any compelling reason why a student has to take it in March. It's also offered in January. I don't see any compelling reason or advantage to taking it in March as opposed to May or June. The biggest exception would be oftentimes our kids are taking multiple AP exams, and those occur in those first couple of weeks in May. So I think for the kid who's in that situation, he doesn't want to take his SATs on Saturday sandwiched around 2 weeks of AP exams. So if that in that case, I think March isn't a bad idea, or June. And then knowing that kids will have an opportunity to come back in the fall of their senior year and retake it again. A few years back, they started offering the SAT in August prior to school, even beginning of the school year, which has its pros and cons. And kids can take it as late as October of senior year. I do think it's wise to take the test multiple times. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. But most colleges super score, which means if you take the test, let's say 3 times, they're going to take your highest math score from one sitting and pair it up with your highest reading and writing score, even if it comes from a different test date. So that's what they call super scoring, and that's why I think it's advantage for kids to take multiple tests.
That's a really good point, John, on the super scoring piece. Now, there are very few colleges out there, I think, that require students to submit all of their test scores. They allow students to choose, and when you're sending your official scores and you log into the College Board, you actually get to choose which ones will be sent. But if you choose to send them to Georgetown, for example, they require students to submit all the scores that they've
Right.
taken. And the nice thing about it is the College Board, when you choose those scores, it tells you what the college wants, so you don't have to worry about that too much. But you can choose, and you know exactly what they're going to see, and where that goes. Can you talk a little bit about that, the test optional piece? And this year I just got the report from the Common Application that this is the first year since the pandemic that the number of submitters of test scores has outnumbered the non-submitters. I guess, in other words, I'm seeing, even though test optional has become a big part of it, a lot of colleges are going back to requiring it. Do you have thoughts on that?
Of course I do. I think you have to go back, take a kind of a little bit of a historical look at it, right? Even pre-COVID, there were, a handful of colleges, maybe more than a handful of colleges in the country that were test optional. And, those colleges were making a statement saying, we don't feel that your performance on a, 3-hour exam is as telling as, your performance in 3 years in high school and your extracurriculars and blah, blah, blah. So there were a handful of schools that were test optional. And you can argue, for or against that, but like I said, the schools I think that were test optional, were saying basically we think there's other parts of your application package that we think are more important. So then COVID strikes, and College Board and ACT are in a quandary because kids can't test, right? I mean, test centers are closed. Some kids were able to take it once and not take it a second time. So it kind of threw both of those companies for a loop for a bit, and in high school kids, right, and college admissions offices who lean on data. So what happens is a lot of colleges had to quickly pivot and go to be test optional, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because if they wanted to, they could have done that well before COVID. So now colleges were test optional, and kind of threw a wrinkle and a wrench in a lot of college admissions offices. Like that was a big piece of the puzzle, as you well know, in a lot of places is kids' performance on standardized tests. So now you come out of COVID, and some colleges said, well, we're going to continue to stay test optional because that worked for us. Others said, no, we really want that data point back. And predictably so, colleges are slowly, maybe not slowly anymore, coming back into we're going to require standardized tests. As it always does, it starts with the heavy hitters, right? The Ivy League schools slowly said, hey, we're going to require SATs again. Then everyone else kind of followed suit. So, I mean, there are schools out there, and I tell kids now the same thing I told them during COVID, that if they have an opportunity to take the test, even if it is test optional, it behooves them to take the test. Um, Especially now. I mean, there's no reason why kids can't take the test now. I think when you choose not to, or you choose not to submit them, there's a little bit of human nature that comes into play here, right? Where people are like, well, he either didn't do well, is most likely the most likely reason why you're not submitting them, right? I mean, there's a little bit of common sense there. So I don't think colleges are lying when they say they're test optional. They're right. You don't have to take them. But I still remember having a conversation with a gentleman at Cornell who I know in the admissions office, and he said, "No, they're test optional." He says, "But a lot of things are test optional, like or a lot of things are optional, like being a good kid is optional, taking a rigorous curriculum. All those things are optional. But if you don't do them, you put yourself in a tough spot." So my advice regarding test optional now has been take the tests, take them multiple times, pretend that there is no such creature as test optional. Get the highest test score you possibly can. Then use the test optional piece to your advantage, to your strategic advantage when you decide to apply to colleges. I'll give you a simple example. Most colleges post their mid 50th percentile SAT scores, which essentially means these numbers may be wrong, but I'll be fairly close. So let's say University of Rochester. If I went online today and looked at the U of R and said, okay, what's the mid 50th percentile of SAT scores at U of R? It's probably going to be somewhere between the 1400 and I'll say 1540. Again, I'm making those numbers up. So what that's saying is the U of R is saying, hey, 50% of the kids that we accept have an SAT score that falls in the range of 1400 to 1540, right? 25% of the kids we accept have an SAT score higher than 1540, and 25% have a score lower than 1400. So if I'm sitting there with an 1190 SAT score and I'm applying to the University of Rochester and they're telling me they're test optional, I'd be considered quite silly to submit my 1190 when they're giving me an opportunity not to. Um, if I apply to Nazareth University, where their mid 50 percentile scores are much lower, and again, I'm making these numbers up, but let's say at Nazareth they're from 1050 to 1200, and I'm sitting and I have an 1190, quite the opposite, right? I'd be kind of foolish not to submit my scores. So again, to me, you use test optional to your advantage in terms of the strategy you use just to decide whether or not you're gonna submit them. And again, keeping in mind that if you have a solid SAT score or ACT score, it's one other plus that you have in your favor. Just like having a strong extracurricular activity, or having a rigorous transcript, or having a knockout essay. So without one, it's just one less thing that people have in your favor.
Yeah, I think your advice is my time on the college side. If a student and I worked at one of those schools that was at Hobart and William Smith that was test optional well before
Right.
COVID hit because they had a lot of data that showed that for some students test scores really weren't a good indicator of their skills and abilities, even though for most students they truly were. And if a student didn't submit scores, that means the heat and light is going to shine really brightly on your transcript, on your course selection, on your performance, on your recommendations, and what they say about your intellectual ability. And that student, I think, had to really stand out at a higher level than the rest of our pool because the test scores weren't there. So in some ways, it puts a greater light on other aspects of your academic record if you don't submit your scores.
Right. And
Um,
you know this better than most, having spent 30 years in college admissions. Transcripts are hard to compare. They're very hard to compare. So that's why standardized measures or standardized tests, they help, right? It's data is comparable and measurable. I'll give you a classic example. I spent 30 plus years working at Fairport High School in the college admissions office or college counseling office. At Fairport High School, we were on a numerical 1 through 100 grading scale with no weighted courses. So I had numerous conversations with people saying, our kids are getting cheated because they take an AP bio, they don't get any extra oomph to it, and blah blah blah. So I come to McQuaid, and McQuaid is on a numerical grading system also, but our kids who take APs, excuse me, in advanced classes get a 4% bump. Some schools are on a letter system. Like for years, Pittsford was on A through D, A plus, B minus, whatever system. Some schools on the west side are on a 4.0 or a 5.0 scale. So my point is, it's very difficult to compare transcripts. I'm just talking about schools within a 10-mile radius, right?
right.
In the college admissions office, you're dealing all over the country, all over the world. So to me, that's what makes standardized test scores so important because it's just an easy comparison, right? Does it does it all hinge on that? It doesn't. But when you're in the absence of test scores, when all you have to compare transcripts, essays, letters of recommendation, and a lot of quote soft data, it's hard to do. You know that better than most.
Yeah, and I think there's a national set of data that's saying there's been great inflation since COVID, so that in fact transcripts are even more difficult to decipher now
Right.
than they were years ago. Thus explaining, I think, especially why the Ivy's the most selective places, and most of the state flagship institutions, especially as you head south, University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, Florida, Texas, they are all reinstituted standardized testing requirements as a piece of the puzzle. John, do you have advice about what's the best way for students to prepare for these exams, what they should be thinking about ahead of time, and how they should plan for that?
I do. Like I said before, I've spent a ton of time tutoring, a ton and ton, lots of tons of time tutoring, and teaching SAT prep classes. So I have a huge opinion, and I'm going back to something I said earlier. The tests are language heavy tests. They're incredibly biased in favor of kids who read a lot. All right. Kids who are not well read are going to struggle on the SAT. It's as simple as that. Um, because they're going to struggle with the comprehension, they're going to struggle with their pacing, they're going to struggle with the grammar, they're going to struggle with the vocab. And quite frankly, the kids who do well on the reading and writing portion of the SAT and ACT are kids who are comfortable reading about a wide variety of topics and things that they're not necessarily interested in, right? Because that's coming, right? You're not gonna get 10 things that they're going, oh, I'm really cool. I'm reading about the Buffalo Bills or things that are that interesting to me. It's not going to happen, right? So reading is the single best way you can prepare, right? And when I do presentations, in high schools, I always kind of half jokingly, half not say, I'm standing talking in front of parents of kids who are juniors who are going to take the SAT in like 4 weeks. And we really should be having this presentation like in middle school, where we're talking about you really want to prepare for these tests, make language acquisition important, make reading important, make problem solving important. So, I mean, that's long-term prep, right?
Mhm.
Grow your vocabulary, learn grammar rules, read a variety of topics. You don't have to read Shakespeare, right? Or classics for that matter. But, read anything you can get your grubby little hands on that helps you grow your vocabulary. Um, there's a gentleman who teaches at Fairport High School, a good friend of mine, who's probably one of the most well-read and skilled language people I know, who will say to you that growing up he read Sports Illustrated. That's pretty much predominantly all he read. But he read and he read and he read, and his vocabulary was extensive and his skill set's extensive. So reading is the first thing you can do. Short-term wise, all research tells you that the best preparation is taking old tests.
Mm.
And when the hard part right now is there aren't that many old tests out there because the SAT just changed a couple minutes ago, but they're out there. You can Google digital SAT tests online, College Board, and find them. You can walk into Barnes and Noble or go on Amazon. You can find no shortage of people willing to take your money and sell you test books. But from the reading and writing part, again, it's reading, growing your vocabulary, learning language or learning grammar skills, understanding how to analyze a chart or a graph and interpret data from there. And it's just a lot of repetition. Now, like I said, I've done this forever, so I can almost tell you what's coming next on the test. So I think if kids were to spend some time on this, you quickly get into a rhythm of understanding what they're looking for. And it's not that hard to figure out what they're looking for. The tests tend to be strikingly similar. The math is different just simply because I think the math's a little bit more difficult to prepare for and it's a little bit less predictable than the reading and writing, but it's algebra and geometry. And there's review books. There's Khan Academy online does a great job doing SAT math prep for kids. But I always tell kids that I think the key to preparation is that you have to be consistent with it. That doesn't come as a big surprise, right? So, I'll get people who will call me like on a Wednesday night and say, "Hey, my son's taking the SATs on Saturday. Could you tutor him on Thursday night?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'll be happy to, but in an hour and 15 minutes, I'm not going to be able to erase the fact that he really hasn't read much for 17 years, right?" So, practice tests, language skills, those are incredibly important. There's plenty of classes out there you can take. I'm a big fan of the one-on-one tutoring just because I think it's the most impactful thing to do. That's just my own bias.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your point, one of the things that I'm always challenging students to do is when they get their scores, let's dig into the score report and help you understand where you're doing well, where you weren't doing so well, so that you can then turn your attention in that way. And what one of the things that you mentioned that I have seen that is the biggest challenge for our students is the grammar section of knowing where to put the comma is a skill that you gotta work at.
Yeah, knowing how to use a semicolon,
Yes,
knowing how to
because
use a colon, those are sprinkled all over the SAT. And I always tell kids, like I was tutoring a girl from Fairport last night, and we're talking about properly using semicolons. She was wildly excited about the conversation. Just kidding. But I said to her, I said, I said, if I walk through this library and ask 30 adults to properly use a semicolon in a sentence, they're not going to know how to do it. And it's just stuff like that. You have to know if you're going to perform.
it's important. Do you have is this changing topics but related? Do you have advice about how students use SATs and their scores in how they actually build the list of schools to consider? I'm maybe a little conservative on that front, but I always want students to have a couple schools on their list where their scores do put them at the top of a college's range of SATs.
Yeah, I think that mid 50th percentile that we spoke about a little bit earlier is important. Do I think it's like all telling? I don't, right? Because now I think those numbers are a little bit skewed upward,
Hmm.
right? Because you have kids who aren't submitting. But I still think that's a good place to at least give you a frame of reference. So, I'm going to go back and use that example about the University of Rochester, right? If my highest SAT score is 200 points below the low point of their mid 50th percentile, that's a problem, right? The likelihoods, that means you're not going to get in, it doesn't mean that, but the likelihood of you getting in decreases significantly. So, just like, I think it's important to have, I hate these terms, when people say reach schools and safety
Hmm.
schools, but I think it's important to have, reach schools and safety schools, from a selectivity standpoint. I also think it's important to have reach and safety schools from a financial aid standpoint, where, all of a sudden you get your results back and you go, oh, I'm going to have to pay 75 grand for any of
Hmm.
these schools. I also think you can use your SAT scores to help you somewhat determine the level of selectivity and your perceived chances of getting in, right? So let me use the example I just used. Let's say I have an 1190 SAT score, and the 7 schools I applied to, their mid 50th percentile ranges are all similar to the University of Rochester's, where the low point is 1400. That's problematic.
Very. Yeah, I think I'm always one who says you want a couple schools on your list. And for exactly what you also just mentioned, that I think SATs, ACTs are at some schools playing a role in the financial aid that you receive. So if that's a concern for families, I always want to make sure they have options
Yeah, I'm glad you
there.
mentioned financial aid too, because I want to be sure they talk about this too. As you well know, a lot of times kids will get their scores back. Let's say they'll take their test once, and I don't know, let's say they come in and have like a 1290, and they'll say to you or me or whoever, or Mr. Griffin, they'll say, well, look, my 1290 is well within the range of, mid 50th percentile of the schools that I'm looking at. It's at the high end. So therefore, I'm not going to test again. And I might say, well, you know what, taking it again, let's say you apply to school X and internally they have a merit scholarship for kids who are in the, top 10% of their class, have a 1300 SAT score or whatever. Now you may have missed out on like 40, $50,000 worth of scholarship money because you landed with a 1290 instead of a 1300. So again, I think you're right. I think a lot of people when they think of SATs, they think it's used just for admissibility, which it is, but it's also sometimes factored into your financial aid package.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think at a lot of the colleges, especially those around us, I've certainly seen students who take it a second time, and even just by the nature of taking it a second time, their score tends to improve a little bit, and who knows if that'll tip them over the edge onto a good pile when it comes to an admissions decision, or certainly for scholarship.
Yeah, even like when you'd asked me a couple of minutes ago about like timeline when to test, like the difference, and this will sound minuscule, but the difference between testing in January of your junior year and let's say June of your junior year. And, you have 6 months more language development under your belt, which can be significant, at that age. 6 months more math under your belt. So just like everything now, I mean, I think kids and families are rushing to get everything done, right? The college, everything has to be done early. The testing has to be done early. If you're an athlete, you're getting recruited god awful early. Um, I don't think it's the wisest thing to jump into this testing craziness, in January of your junior year, unless you have some really compelling reason to do that. So I think the longer you wait, the more, like I said, the more growth you have, especially with your language skills.
That's a great point. And on that, I've had a couple of students come to me, in particular with concern of the math. They're taking advanced math, so their junior year, they're taking calculus or pre-calculus, and oh, the test is mostly algebra and geometry, and that was a couple of years ago. Is it going to be a disadvantage because it's in the rearview mirror a little bit? You have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I have kind of mixed thoughts on that. I think that argument is right, right? So there is no pre-calc and calculus on the SAT or the ACT. So yes, so kids who are accelerated, they're getting further and further away from the algebra and geometry that's going to be tested on the SAT. So there is some truth to that. But there's also some truth in the fact that your math brain is still growing, whether you're taking calc, pre-calc, whatever. And I don't see too many kids, quite frankly, who are, doubly accelerated and say, well, I'm taking, AP calculus as a junior. I don't see those kids underperforming in the math part because they're far removed from the algebra and geometry.
Yeah, and that exactly my point too. I haven't seen evidence in the scores that
No.
it's disadvantaged anybody, and you don't. Most students don't forget how to factor a quadratic as they get older,
Right.
even though they might be a couple years removed from doing it for homework, right?
Yeah, and
It's
when I
still
tutor kids, I always say to them, like the best book that I think is it's out there is published by the College Board, right? They're the only ones that have the ability to reproduce the test because they're their own. Everything else is kind of a knockoff. But in the standard, SAT study guide that the College Board puts out, the latter half of the book has four actual tests.
Mhm.
The first half of the book, which no one uses, has some drills and some algebra and some geometry. So there's like 12 pages. I always say to kids, go back and reread these 12 pages. But because in those 12 pages, quite frankly, is all the algebra and geometry review that you need.
Yep, I agree. Last question I have for you, and that is, it's the night before the morning of the test. Do you have any advice for people in that last 24 hours? It's Friday, and they're going to be taking that test on Saturday, about what they should be doing, what they should be thinking about.
I do. One thing I tell the kids that I tutor is the Friday night before the test, you're not doing anything. I mean, this isn't something where you're just going to rush and fill your brain with data and social studies dates. It's not that type of test, right? It's this test that's testing your knowledge that you've acquired over years. So I think there's a lot of value in just quite frankly, resting your brain, get a good night's sleep, get up, have breakfast and prepare yourself for the logistical part of the next day. When I was at Fairport High School, I was the test center supervisor, which meant I had the privilege of, every time there was an SAT or ACT, testing about 700 kids from all over Monroe County. Right? So the kids are coming here, you're coming to Fairport High School, and they have to bring their admission ticket and they have to bring photo ID and they have to bring a calculator and they have to bring pencils and they have to come on time and they have to find their room. And not trying to be sarcastic, but that's hard for a lot of kids, and especially kids who weren't from Fairport. So, kids who are coming from, trying to find a place. And I could write a fairly funny book about the occasions that happened every Saturday morning at Fairport High School, where I have to turn kids away because they're late, or I forgot my calculator, or I don't have my ticket, or but I've got my name on my jacket. Well, that doesn't count as photo ID. It's just basic stuff like that. So I just tell kids, get a good night rest, be prepared, be on time, be early, take away all that stress. The kids I tutor, the very last thing I say to them, I say, here's the last thing I want you to do before you go to bed on Friday night. I want you to do the first thing we did when we started tutoring, which is when I sat here and I gave you about 15 to 17 grammar rules. And I said, that's the last thing you should do on Friday night before you go to sleep is this. Okay, I know how to use a semicolon. I know how to use a colon. I know what an adverb is. I know what a comma splice is. Just stuff like that. And then I think because those are on every test, every time, and it's the most predictable thing.
That's great. And yeah, as you said, a good night's sleep and have something to eat in the morning and leave yourself plenty of time because for the vast majority of our students, they will be going to an unfamiliar place to take this exam and leaving themselves some time to get acclimated and settled
We'd have
is
like a demolition derby at the park. I'd be looking out the windows at Fairport High School, kids coming in, they're running into each other, and it was chaos. And you don't need to add stress to that morning.
absolutely. It's stressful enough. Why add to it? Well, I very much appreciate you taking the time to spend with us and with our families, and we're wishing everybody a ton of luck as they move forward. Any last thoughts for the crowd?
No, I just think, I mean, I'd be happy to, anybody wants to talk to me I'd be happy to field any questions or meet with anyone here. I kind of want my old job back. I like your job, just kidding. But I really enjoy the college process, and I love preparing kids for SAT and ACT, and it's important. And it just can't be something that's done last minute, and it can't be something that's done inconsistently. The analogy I always use with kids is I say, look, I said, if I take my grossly out of shape body downstairs and start lifting weights, and I go down on Monday, and then 3 months later I pick it up, I'm still going to be the grossly out of shape person that I am. So it's the same thing with this. You have to get on some kind of a consistent schedule and work at it. And I tell kids, I'm not a big fan of sending you home to say, hey, take a 4 hour practice SAT every Saturday.
Right.
Little pieces with some consistency. You can see some huge strides if you stick with it.
That's important. And Mr. Griffin and I, when we meet with the juniors in particular, one of the things we talk about them with is what's your testing plan? Let's make sure we've got this laid out and know, are you going to take a March test? Are you going to take a June test? Are you planning to take one in August or September? Because then it's much easier to back things up from there and make sure people are
Sure.
planning thoughtfully and will walk in the doors as confidently as they can.
True.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time
Thanks for having me.
and stay warm, please.
I'll try. All right. Thanks again, Jen. I appreciate it. Thanks for doing this whole week.
Absolutely. It's fun.
Okay.